Next chapter: reception, response and coordination in animals. Now, coordination between various organs and systems of the body is crucial to homeostasis or body stability. Irritability in animals is much more complex than in plants and is through the nervous system. All animals have a neural system that consists of highly specialized cells called neurons. These cells can perceive, receive, and transmit different kinds of stimuli. Therefore, neurons are the structural and functional units of the neural system. Neural organization varies from lower invertebrates to vertebrates. For example, flatworms have a ladder-like neural system which is composed of nerve rings and nerve cords. They are interconnected by transverse connectives. In arthropods, the nervous system consists of peripheral nerves and a ventral nerve cord. In the head, there is a brain formed by a concentration of nerve fibers which form a cerebral ganglia. The neural or nervous system is most developed in primates, especially in human beings. In humans, irritability is brought about by the nervous and the endocrine systems. The nervous system. The nervous system is divided into two: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord constitute the central nervous system. It is the site of information processing and control. The peripheral nervous system comprises the cranial and spinal nerves and controls the voluntary functions of the body. The nerve fibers of peripheral nerves are of two types: afferent or sensory nerve fibers and efferent or motor nerve fibers. Afferent fibers conduct nerve impulses from sense organs to the central nervous system. Efferent fibers conduct nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the effector organs, usually skeletal muscles and glands, which will initiate a response. The peripheral nervous system can further be divided into two: the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The function of the somatic nervous system is to relay impulses from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system controls involuntary functions such as heartbeat, peristalsis, and so on. Structure and functions of the neuron. A neuron is a branched nerve cell and is the longest cell in the body. The two main parts of a neuron are the cell body and the nerve processes. The cell body is also called the cytone or soma and contains granular cytoplasm, also called neuroplasm. The neuroplasm contains a large spherical nucleus, granular bodies called nisyl granules that help in protein synthesis, a large number of mitochondria for energy synthesis, and thread-like neurofibrils which help in the conduction of impulses. Nerve processes are of two types: dendrons and axons. Dendrons can be one or more in number. Their fine branches are called dendrites, and they transmit impulses towards the cell body. An axon is always single. It is covered by a plasma membrane called axolemma, and the inner fluid of the axon is called axoplasm. The distal branched end of an axon forms a knob-like swelling called a synaptic knob. It contains synaptic vesicles, which contain chemicals called neurotransmitters. On the basis of the number of axons and dendrites, neurons are divided into three: multipolar, bipolar, and unipolar. Multipolar neurons have one axon and two or more dendrites and are found in the cerebral cortex. Bipolar neurons with one axon and one dendrite are found in the retina of the eye. Unipolar neurons have a cell body with one axon and are found in the photoreceptor cells of the retina. Axons can be myelinated or non-myelinated. Myelinated nerve fibers are enclosed by Schwann cells, which form a myelin sheath around the axon. The gaps between two myelin sheaths are called the nodes of Ranvier. These fibers are found in the cranial and spinal nerves. Non-myelinated nerve fibers are enclosed by Schwann cells that do not form myelin sheaths around the axon. These nerve fibers are found in the autonomic and somatic nervous systems. On the basis of functions, neurons can be divided into three types: sensory, motor, and association neurons. Sensory or afferent neurons are found in the sense organs like the eye, ear, skin, and so on. They receive impulses from receptors and relay them to the central nervous system. Motor or efferent neurons link the central nervous system to effector organs like muscle fibers and glands. They carry impulses from the central nervous system to the effector organs. Association neurons, also called interneurons or relay neurons, are found in the central nervous system. They interlink the axon of a sensory neuron with the dendron of a motor neuron. The central nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord are collectively known as the central nervous system. It does not include the nerves arising from the spinal cord. The brain is the central information processing organ and acts as the command and control system. It controls both voluntary and involuntary activities of our body organs. It also controls the processes of vision, hearing, speech, memory, intelligence, emotions, and thoughts. The brain lies inside the skull and is well protected by three layers of meninges. These are the outer dura mater, the middle arachnoid, and the inner pia mater. The space between the arachnoid and pia mater is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which acts as a shock absorber and prevents the brain tissue from rubbing against other parts. The brain can be divided into three main parts: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain is the largest part of the brain. It is made up of the cerebrum, thalamus, and hypothalamus. A deep cleft divides the cerebrum into two halves, the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. A thick band of nerve fibers called corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres and facilitates communication between them. The cerebral hemispheres are covered with a layer of cells called the cerebral cortex. It has prominent folds with ridges and depressions called gyri and sulci respectively. The neural cell bodies concentrated in the cerebral hemispheres lend a gray color to the region, and therefore the cerebral cortex is called gray matter. It contains motor areas, sensory areas, and association areas. Due to the presence of myelinated axons, the inner part of the cerebral hemisphere appears white and is therefore called white matter. The thalamus is located between the cerebral cortex and the midbrain and acts as a major coordinating center for sensory and motor signaling. The hypothalamus is located at the base of the thalamus and contains centers that control body temperature, the circadian rhythms, and the urge to eat and drink. Several groups of neurosecretory cells are also present in the hypothalamus. They secrete hormones that control the pituitary, which in turn controls the secretions of other endocrine glands. The collection of structures within the forebrain, including the amygdala and hippocampus, is known as the limbic system. The limbic system, along with the hypothalamus, is responsible for regulation of sexual behavior, long-term memory, olfaction, and the expression of emotional reactions such as excitement, pleasure, anger, fear, and motivation. The midbrain is located between the thalamus and hypothalamus of the forebrain and the pons of the hindbrain. The dorsal portion of the midbrain consists of 4 lobes called corpora quadrigemina. It contains reflex centers for vision and hearing. The midbrain and the hindbrain form the brainstem. It acts as a relay station for auditory and visual information. That is, every impulse conducted between the brain and the spinal cord passes through the brainstem. The hindbrain consists of the pons, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata. The pons consist of fiber tracts that interconnect the cerebral cortex and medulla to the cerebellum. Convoluted surface of the cerebellum provides a lot of space to accommodate large number of neurons. This part is responsible for coordinated body movements or balance of the body. The medulla oblongata acts as a link between the brain and the spinal cord. The centers in the medulla oblongata controls involuntary activities such as breathing, blood pressure, cardiovascular reflexes, and gastric secretions. Next, we look at the spinal cord. The spinal cord is about 18 inches long and extends from the base of the brain, down the middle of the back, to just below the last rib in the waist area. The main job of the spinal cord is to be the communication system between the brain and the body by carrying messages that allow us to move and feel sensation. It is made up of gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is head-shaped and surrounds a central canal which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This gray matter relays information between the sensory and motor neurons. It consists of cell bodies and dendrites of relay and motor neurons. These give it its dark appearance, hence the term gray matter. Surrounding the gray matter is the white matter, which consists of axons of sensory and motor neurons. The myelin sheath of these neurons gives this part its shiny white appearance. Arising from the spinal cord are dorsal and ventral roots of the spinal nerves. Neurons carry messages to and fro the spinal cord. These messages leave the spinal cord through openings in the vertebrae. Spinal nerve fibers branch off the spinal cord in pairs, one going to each side of the body. In case of a spinal injury, sensation and movement may be interrupted. Next is generation and conduction of nerve impulses. Now, neurons are excitable cells that can be stimulated by physical, mechanical, chemical, or electrical stimuli. The nerve impulse is the sum of mechanical, chemical, and electrical disturbances created by a stimulus in a neuron. The conduction of a nerve impulse can be divided into two phases: resting membrane potential and action membrane potential. The nerve fiber or axon is covered with a neural membrane which has sodium and potassium ion channels called voltage-gated channels. These channels open or close according to the electrical potential across the membrane. The ion channels of a resting membrane are differentially permeable to ions at different rates. It is more permeable to potassium ions, almost impermeable to sodium ions, and completely impermeable to the negatively charged proteins of the exoplasm. Therefore, the exoplasm inside the axon contains a high concentration of potassium ions, negatively charged proteins, and a low concentration of sodium ions. Conversely, the extracellular fluid outside the axon has a low concentration of potassium ions and a high concentration of sodium ions. This differential permeability is maintained by a sodium-potassium pump present on the membrane. The pump transports 3 sodium ions outside the cell for every 2 potassium ions that enter the cell. This unequal distribution of charged ions and the fact that they are negatively charged particles within the exoplasm creates an electrical potential difference across the membrane in a non-excited nerve fiber called resting potential. The neuron is said to be polarized. When a stimulus is applied to a point, say site A on the polarized membrane, the sodium ion channels open and the membrane at the site becomes freely permeable to sodium ions. This leads to a rapid influx of sodium ions that reverses the polarity of the site. That is, the outer surface of the membrane becomes negatively charged and the inner surface becomes positively charged. This reversal of polarity across the membrane is called depolarization. The electrical potential difference across the membrane at site A is called the action potential. This action potential travels as a wave of depolarization along the length of the nerve fiber in a particular direction, and this is called the nerve impulse. Meanwhile, at site B, the axon membrane has a positive charge on the outer surface and a negative charge on the inner surface. As a result, a current flows on the inner surface from site A to site B. On the outer surface, a current flows from site B to A to complete the circuit. This reverses the polarity at the site and an action potential is generated at site B. Therefore, the impulse generated at site A arrives at site B. The sequence repeats along the length of the axon for the impulse to be conducted. At the peak of the action potential, the membrane permeability to sodium ions decreases and becomes more permeable to potassium ions. This is because the sodium ion channels start closing and potassium ion channels start opening. This part of the membrane regains its polarity within milliseconds, and this phenomenon is called repolarization. A repolarized nerve fiber undergoes a refractory period of a few milliseconds, during which the original ion distribution is restored by the sodium-potassium pump, which actively transports sodium ions outwards and potassium ions inwards. This returns the membrane to its resting potential, and the neuron is ready to receive another stimulus. A junction helps to transmit the nerve impulse from one neuron to another. These junctions are called synapses. A synapse is formed by the membranes of a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, which may or may not be separated by a gap called the synaptic cleft. There are two types of synapses based on the nature of transmission of information: chemical and electrical synapses. Chemical synapses are common in the human systems and consist of a presynaptic neuron, a synaptic cleft, and a postsynaptic neuron. A presynaptic neuron ends with the synaptic knob, which has a large number of mitochondria and many synaptic vesicles. Each synaptic vesicle contains neurotransmitter chemical molecules such as acetylcholine. A synaptic cleft is a fluid-filled gap between the axon terminal and the dendron of another neuron, so there is no protoplasmic continuity between neurons. When an impulse or action potential arrives at the axon terminal, it stimulates the movement of the synaptic vesicles towards the presynaptic membrane. The vesicles fuse with the presynaptic membrane and release the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter so released binds to specific chemoreceptors present on the postsynaptic membrane of the dendron. This binding opens sodium ion channels that allows entry of sodium ions to generate an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. Immediately afterwards, acetylcholine released in the synaptic cleft is destroyed by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, giving acetic acid and choline, effectively stopping the stimulation of the postsynaptic neuron. Next, we look at reflex action. Now, we react instantly when we come into contact with an extremely hot or sharp object. This quick, immediate, involuntary response to an external stimulus that occurs without any conscious effort or thought is called reflex action. Reflex action requires involvement of only a part of the central nervous system, usually the spinal cord. The path through which a reflex action is conducted is called a reflex arc. The reflex arc consists of a receptor, a sensory or afferent neuron, an interneuron, a motor or efferent neuron, and an effector organ. The sensory neuron receives an impulse from the sensory organs, such as the skin, and transmits it through the dorsal nerve root into the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, The sensory neuron is connected to the relay neuron, which transmits the impulse to the motor neuron. The motor neuron then transmits the impulse to the effector organ, such as muscle, through the ventral nerve cord. Such a reflex arc saves time by bypassing the impulse transmission to the brain and therefore avoid prolonged exposure to harm because the thought process of the brain is a bit slow. Now we look at sensory organs, and we start with the eye. The eye is the organ of vision. It helps us detect visual changes in the environment and dispatch the signal to the central nervous system. Humans have a pair of spherical eyes located in the eye sockets or orbits of the skull. The eyes are directed forward and adapted for binocular vision. They are protected by the eyebrows, eyelids, and the lacrimal gland. The glands secrete an aqueous solution that lubricates the eyes and helps rotate the eyeballs freely. The wall of the human eye is composed of 3 layers. The external sclera is made up of a dense connective tissue. The anterior portion of the sclera is the cornea. The middle layer, choroid, is bluish in color and contains many blood vessels. The choroid layer is thin over the posterior 2/3 of the eyeball and thick in the anterior region where it forms a ciliary body. The ciliary body continues to form the iris, the visible colored portion of the eye. The eyeball contains a transparent crystalline lens held in place by the ligaments of the ciliary body. In front of the lens, the iris surrounds an aperture called the pupil. The muscle fibers of the iris regulates the diameter of the pupil. The inner layer is the retina, which contains 3 layers of cells. The innermost layer is called the ganglion cells. The middle layer is called the bipolar cells, and the outermost layer is called photoreceptor cells. Photoreceptor cells are of 2 types, rods and cones. These cells contain photopigments. The cones are responsible for color vision and daylight vision. The rods are responsible for twilight vision. A photopigment called rhodopsin is present in the rods, which contain a derivative of vitamin A and is sensitive to dim light. A violet pigment called iodopsin is present in the cones, which are sensitive to bright daylight or photopic vision. Cones are of 3 types and contain different photopigments and respond to red, green, and blue light radiations. Other colors are detected by simultaneous stimulation of more than 1 type of cones. Equal stimulation of the 3 types of cones produce a sensation of white light. The cones are insensitive to dim light, and so a person cannot see colors at night. The optical part of the retina contains 2 parts, known as the blind spot and the fovea. The blind spot is the region on the posterior pole of the eye where the optical nerve leaves the eye and the retinal blood vessels enter the organ. Photoreceptor cells are absent in this region, and therefore no image forms in the blind spot. The posterior end of the eyeball, lateral to the blind spot, has a yellowish pigmented spot called the macula lutea, with a central pit called fovea. The density of cones in this region provides the best visual acuity. The aqueous chamber lies between the cornea and the lens. It is filled with a thin watery fluid called aqueous humor that provides nutrition to the lens and cornea. The vitreous chamber is larger than the aqueous chamber and lies between the lens and the retina. It is filled with a transparent gel called vitreous humor that gives shape to the eye, supports the retina and lens, refracts light rays, and maintains intraocular pressure inside the eye. The human eye works like a camera. The cornea, aqueous humor, lens, and the vitreous humor all act as small lenses and refract light rays to focus on the retina. The iris acts as a diaphragm and regulates the amount of light entering the eye. Maximum refraction is done by the cornea, and the lens bring final adjustments. Light radiations stimulate the photoreceptors on the retina and form a small and inverted image. The object's image is perceived in the right manner due to the interpretation of nerve impulses by the brain. Light rays in the visible wavelength focus on the retina to generate impulses in the rods and cones. The impulses are transmitted to the visual areas of the cerebellum by the optic nerve. They are interpreted here and helps to recognize the image formed. Now we look at accommodation of the eye. The lens of the eye is surrounded by ciliary muscles which hold the lens in place and help to change the focal length by adjusting the curvature of the lens. To view a distant object, the muscles relax, the lens becomes thin, and its focal length increases. To view a nearby object, the muscles contract, the lens becomes thick, and the focal length decreases. This ability to adjust its focal length is called accommodation of the eye, or the power of accommodation. Defects of vision. Now, the minimum distance from which the eye can see objects clearly is called the near point, or the least distance of distinct vision. In a normal eye, it's 25 centimeters. The farthest distance up to which the eye can see objects clearly is called the far point of the eye. In a normal eye, it is between 25 centimeters and infinity. The eye can gradually lose the power of accommodation, resulting into blurred vision due to refractive defects. There are 4 common defects of vision. Hypermetropia, or long-sightedness. In this defect, nearby objects cannot be seen clearly, but far objects are clear. This is because the images of near objects are formed behind the retina. This may be caused by an increase in focal length of the lens or a decrease in the length of the eyeball. This defect can be corrected using a convex lens of suitable focal length. Myopia, or short-sightedness. This is an eye defect in which far objects cannot be seen clearly, but near objects are clear. This is because the images of far objects are formed in front of the retina. This defect may occur due to decrease in focal length of the lens or due to increasing length of the eyeball. It can be corrected using a concave lens of suitable focal length. Presbyopia is common in elderly people. Here, Nearby objects cannot be seen clearly due to increase in distance of the near point. It may be due to weakening of the ciliary muscles or reduced flexibility of the lens. This defect can be corrected using a convex lens of suitable focal length. At times, both nearby and distant objects cannot be seen clearly, and this can be corrected using a bifocal lens. The upper part is concave, correcting distant vision, and the lower end is convex, correcting near vision. Astigmatism is seen when images may be clearly focused on the retina in the horizontal plane but not in the vertical plane. This defect may be due to irregular curvature of the cornea or lens. It can be corrected using glasses with cylindrical lens. Next organ is the ear. Now, the ear is an important organ that not only assists in hearing but also helps the body maintain balance. It is divided into three sections: the outer ear, middle ear, and the inner ear. The outer and middle ear structures assist only in hearing, while the inner ear also helps to maintain the body's balance. The outer ear comprises of a funnel-shaped structure called the pinna and an S-shaped tube called the external auditory meters. The pinna is responsible for collecting vibrations in air and directing sound into the meters. The meters further extends into the middle ear. The middle ear consists of an air-filled space called the tympanic cavity that separates the outer and inner ear. The tympanic cavity is bound externally by the tympanic membrane, also called the eardrum, and internally by an auditory capsule. The tympanic membrane is composed of connective tissue that is covered with the skin on the outside and a mucous membrane on the inside. The auditory capsule, on the other hand, has two membrane-bound apertures called the oval window and the round window. The middle ear has three small movable bones or ossicles called the malleus, incus, and stapes on the floor of the tympanic cavity. They increase the efficiency of transmission of sound waves to the inner ear. Air pressure also needs to be maintained on both sides of the eardrum for normal hearing. This is done by the eustachian tube, which connects the tympanic cavity to the pharynx. The inner ear consists of a complex system of intercommunicating chambers and tubes called a labyrinth. The labyrinth consists of two functional parts: the cochlea, which is responsible for hearing, and the vestibular structures, which is responsible for balance. The labyrinth is of two types: bony and membranous. The bony labyrinth is a series of channels filled with a fluid called perilymph, while the membranous labyrinth lies within the bony labyrinth and is filled with an endolymph. The cochlea is the coiled portion of the bony labyrinth and is also called the auditory section of the inner ear. It has two membranes, Reisner's membrane and the basilar membrane. Reisner's membrane and basilar membrane divide the labyrinth into an upper section called the scala vestibuli and a lower section called scala tympani, which are both filled with perilymph. The space between them is called scala media and is filled with endolymph. The fluids cushion the labyrinth structures and conduct waves from the middle ear to the organ of Corti. The organ of Corti, located in the scala media, is the actual receptor of sound. It is composed of hair cells that act as auditory receptors. Above the hair cells lies a thin elastic membrane called the tectorial membrane. Each hair cell has a cilia which is in contact with the tectorial membrane, and the basal end is in contact with the afferent nerve fibers. The external ear receives sound waves and directs them to the eardrum. The eardrum vibrates in response to sound waves and transmits them through the ear ossicles, malleus, incus, and stapes to the oval window. The ossicles also amplify the sound and pass the vibrations through the oval window to the fluid of the cochlea. This generates waves in the lymph that induces a ripple in the basilar membrane. The vibrations in the basilar membrane then bend the hair cells, pressing them against the tectorial membrane. The hairs move back and forth against the tectorial membrane, which stimulates the hair cells or receptor cells. As a result, the hair cells generate nerve impulses, which are transmitted along afferent nerve fibers and auditory nerves to the auditory cortex of the brain. The brain interprets these impulses and the sound is recognized. The vestibular apparatus is located above the cochlea and consists of three semicircular canals and the otolith organ, which consists of the saccule and the utricle. Each semicircular canal is C-shaped and is mutually at right angles with the other two and are suspended in the perilymph. The swollen parts of the canals are called ampulla, which contains a sensory spot called the crista ampullaris. The saccule and utricle also contain a sensory part called the macula. Both crista and macula contain hair cells that act as receptors of the vestibular structures and are responsible for maintaining body balance. And finally, the endocrine system. Now, the nerve fibers of the nervous system do not innervate all the body cells. Therefore, the function of regulating the body cells is performed by hormones secreted by the endocrine system. The endocrine system, in association with the nervous system, function in a coordinated way to maintain the physiological functions of the body. The endocrine and nervous systems collectively form the neuroendocrine system. Unlike the nervous system, whose effects are quick and short-lived, the effects of the endocrine system are slow and last longer. The endocrine system consists of various glands present in various parts of the body. The forebrain houses the hypothalamus, which is the basal part of the diencephalon. Just below the hypothalamus is a small pinkish pea-shaped pituitary gland, which is the master gland of the endocrine system. Another gland located on the dorsal side of the forebrain is the pineal gland, which is a small reddish-gray gland shaped like a pine cone. The neck has the largest endocrine gland in the body, the thyroid gland. It lies on the ventral and lateral side of the upper part of the trachea. The thyroid gland has 4 pea-shaped glands embedded wholly or partially in its dorsal surface. These are called the parathyroid glands. Just above the heart, a soft, pinkish, bilobed mass of lymphoid tissue is present, called the thymus gland. In the loop of the duodenum is located an elongated yellow-colored gland called the pancreas, the second largest endocrine gland in the body. On the upper border of each kidney lies the adrenal glands, which are yellowish and triangular in shape. Gonads are also endocrine glands. In males, the gonads are a pair of testes, while in female, they are a pair of ovaries. The endocrine glands pour their secretions directly into the venous blood for passage to different body organs to control and coordinate their functions. Due to the absence of ducts, the endocrine glands are also called ductless glands, and the secretions are called hormones. They are soluble in water and come into contact with virtually all cells of the body as they circulate in blood. However, each hormone usually affects only a limited number of cells called target cells, where it regulates a definite physiological effect. A target cell responds to a hormone because it bears receptors specific to that hormone, and therefore the two will bind.